My name is Haley Chen, I'm 34 years old. And the strange thing about my life is that it always felt quieter than it should have, as if someone turned the volume down on everything except responsibility. And maybe that's why I never learned how to exist in spaces where people speak loudly, laugh freely, or expect things from you without asking. For the last 13 years I've lived in a world of my own making, built from routines, late-night recipes, exhaustion that felt cleaner than emotion, and a kind of survival that didn't require anyone else's approval. And maybe that's why the night I signed the papers for my new house, I stood in the empty living room for a full minute before I believed it was real, before I accepted that a girl who once slept in a back room of a diner could actually afford a place with a front lawn, a driveway, and a kitchen big enough to hold every version of myself I had ever hidden. I moved in with nothing but a folding chair, a blanket, a box of lemon bars that hadn't sold the night before, and the kind of hope that felt sharp enough to cut my fingers if I held it too tightly. For the first time in years, there was no noise, no expectation, no voice behind mine telling me I was wrong before I even finished speaking. It was peaceful. Completely, terrifyingly peaceful. But peace has always been temporary in my life, and the next morning, before I had even unpacked the spices for my baking shelf, the past arrived like it never learned how to use a doorbell. They didn't call, didn't text, didn't hesitate. They simply showed up with suitcases, the same familiar confidence, and the kind of entitlement that only comes from people who believe your growth belongs to them. My mother stood on my porch like the last 13 years were a misunderstanding, and not a distance. She had crafted one assumption at a time. And beside her was my younger sister, Maya Chen, who had always walked through the world like it existed to cushion her feelings first and ask questions later. Seeing them, there felt like someone had reached into my chest and pulled out all the air I'd learned to breathe on my own. They looked at my house like it was theirs, like I was a temporary obstacle standing between them and what they believed they deserved. And for a moment, just one, my old instinct kicked in, the instinct to step aside, to shrink, to let them in before the storm grew bigger. But something in me didn't move. Maybe it was the weight of the house keys in my hand, maybe it was the 13 years of silence that had hardened into backbone, maybe it was the memory of every time I had been blamed for things I didn't do. Every time Maya cried and the entire family shifted its orbit around her, while I became the gravity no one acknowledged. Even with the door barely cracked, I could feel the old dynamic crawling toward me like smoke, familiar, suffocating, rehearsed. Maya tilted her chin the same way she did at 16 when she wanted the world to soften under her feet, and my mother hovered behind her with that look. Half disappointment, half demand, that she once used to convince me I owed the family more than I owed myself. But I wasn't the girl who used to leave work early because Maya misplaced her backpack, or skipped meals because my mother forgot to cook, or apologized for things I didn't understand just to keep the peace from cracking. I stood still, my hand on the edge of the door, and in the silence between us I realized they expected the past to continue exactly where it stopped, as if the 13 years I spent building a life had been an intermission instead of a transformation. They didn't even ask if they could come inside, they assumed they already would. And that assumption was the moment everything inside me aligned in a way I didn't see coming. I didn't raise my voice, didn't explain, didn't defend. I simply didn't move. The space between us held every unanswered question they never bothered to ask. When Maya tried to step forward, I shifted my foot slightly, a boundary so small but so solid she froze. My mother's expression tightened the way it always had when I broke script, when I refused to fold myself into the shape she expected. And for the first time I didn't feel guilt for it. I felt clarity, sharp, steady, earned. I told them calmly that they should have called. I told them their arrival wasn't expected. And when Maya opened her mouth to perform the familiar tremble in her voice, the one that used to make everyone around us fall apart, I didn't break. I didn't bend, I simply said no. A simple word but heavy enough to split the air. They didn't leave quietly. They didn't leave gracefully. They left with glances that tried to sculpt me back into the villain they had made online, in whispers, in family stories that never included my side. And when the door closed, I didn't shake, I simply breathed, a long, steady breath that tasted like something new. Freedom, maybe, or ownership of my own space, but the story didn't end there. It never ends with the door. It always continues through screens. Within an hour, my phone buzzed with messages from cousins who forgot my birthday 10 years in a row but somehow found time today, all forwarding screenshots of Maya's posts. A porch photo, a sad caption, a narrative crafted to make me look like cruelty wrapped in success. I didn't respond. Not because I was afraid, but because engaging would have dragged me back into a version of myself I had worked too hard to outgrow. Instead, I opened a drawer where I kept documents, Old texts, bank transfers, messages, evidence of years no one wanted to remember because the truth was less convenient than the story Maya preferred. I wrote one email to the relatives, short, calm, unemotional, all communication through email only, no emotional manipulation tolerated, no sudden arrivals, no demands, no guilt phrased as morality. Boundaries stated like facts. For the first time, I didn't explain why. I didn't justify, I didn't ask for understanding. I simply set the rules for my own life, the same way I set the temperature for my ovens, precisely, intentionally, without apology. And as the sun set on the second evening in my new home, I realized the story I'm telling didn't begin the morning they showed up. It began long before that, in the quiet spaces of a childhood where responsibility wasn't shared, where roles were assigned, where truth was negotiable, and emotions carried different value depending on who felt them. It began in the years when I learned that silence was easier than speaking, and leaving was easier than staying, and sometimes the only way to survive family is to stop letting them define who you are. But this time I wasn't surviving. I was choosing. And choices once made have consequences, ones my family didn't expect, ones I wasn't finished discovering. And so she kept walking through the dim corridors of memories she wished she could erase. Her breath trembling each time the weight of her past brushed against her thoughts like a cold hand dragging across her spine. Yet she refused to stop, refused to surrender, because deep down she knew that every scar carved into her heart had shaped the fierce woman she had become. A woman who had learned that trust was fragile, that love was dangerous, and that loneliness sometimes felt safer than letting someone close enough to break her again. And as she stepped into the quiet glow of the streetlights outside her apartment, she realized how many nights she had spent standing exactly here, staring at the empty sky, wondering if anyone out there had ever truly seen her, not the version she pretended to be but the silent storms inside her. The fear, the anger, the resilience, all tangled together like threads of a life she never chose, but had no choice except to endure. And when she unlocked her door and stepped into the faint warmth of her room, she felt that familiar ache in her chest, the one that whispered she was still fighting battles no one else knew. Battles that had turned her into a girl with a soft face but a hardened soul, a girl who could smile even while breaking, who could carry the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions without letting her knees collapse. And as she set her phone on the table and sank into the corner of her bed where she had cried countless times, she let her mind drift back to the night everything changed, the night she overheard the whispers that shattered her trust forever, the voices of people she loved plotting against her, laughing at her kindness, twisting her innocence into a weapon they used to hurt her again and again, and that betrayal had carved a permanent mark inside her. A mark that reminded her every day that not everyone who stands beside you truly stands with you. And since that night she had built walls, tall, unbreakable walls, that protected her but also imprisoned her. And she hated that she still remembered their voices, that she could still hear their cruel words echoing whenever she closed her eyes, making her wonder why the people she loved the most were always the ones who broke her the deepest. But she kept moving forward because she had promised herself that she would never let their betrayal define her future, that no matter how painful the memories were, she would rise above them, shaping her life with her own hands, forging strength from the same wounds that once made her weak. And even on nights like this, when her heart felt too heavy to carry and her thoughts too loud to silence, she reminded herself that she had survived everything meant to destroy her. And survival itself was a victory no one could take away. And as she rested her head against the wall, letting the silence fill the room, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, as if the universe was finally whispering that her story wasn't over, that better days were waiting beyond the darkness, that the pain she carried was not a burden but a reminder of how much she had endured. And with a slow breath she closed her eyes, letting the shadows settle, letting the ache soften just a little. Realizing that sometimes healing wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, gradual, like learning to breathe again after drowning, like finding light in places you thought would stay dark forever. And she knew that one day she would look back at this version of herself, the girl who survived betrayal, heartbreak, loneliness, and fear. And she would finally understand just how powerful she truly was, because despite everything she was still here, still fighting, still hopping, still dreaming. Still holding on to the faint glow of a future she hadn't even seen yet but somehow knew would be worth every tear, every scar, every sleepless night. And as she whispered a soft promise to herself, a promise to keep going no matter how hard the journey became, she felt her heart beat a little steadier, her breath grow a little stronger. And in that quiet moment she realized that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply choose to keep living, keep believing. and keep walking forward even when the world tries to pull them back into the darkness they fought so hard to escape. And she didn't stop there, because as the night deepened and the silence grew thicker around her, the memories she had buried long ago began resurfacing one by one, not to haunt her this time, but to remind her why she had become the woman she was now. A woman shaped by storms but never defeated by them. A woman who had learned to hold her own heart together even when it felt like it was splitting at the seams. And she remembered the days when she used to trust too easily. When she believed every soft word, every warm smile, every promise that sounded like comfort but hid poison underneath. And she winced thinking about how many times she had given her heart to people who didn't even know how to hold it gently. People who treated her loyalty like an open door they could walk through whenever it suited them, leaving her to clean the mess each time they left without warning. And she thought about the countless nights she stayed awake overthinking every conversation. Every look, every moment, trying to understand what made her so easy to break, why she became the target of betrayal she never deserved. But then she remembered something else. She remembered how despite all of that, despite every knife that had been twisted into her back, she still found ways to rise, to rebuild, to recreate herself stronger, wiser, harder to fool, and somewhere deep inside she knew that her heart was not weak. It was simply kind in a world that did not know how to appreciate kindness, and maybe that was why she had suffered so much. Because people like her loved with intensity, trusted with purity, and gave without expecting anything in return. And the world had a habit of breaking such hearts just to see if they could survive the fall, but she did survive. She survived every wound, every betrayal, every night she cried quietly so no one would hear her breaking. And she realized that maybe the reason she still remembered all the pain was because her heart had been teaching her lessons she would need later. Lessons about self-worth, lessons about boundaries, lessons about recognizing the difference between people who came with genuine intentions and those who only came with empty words. And as she looked around her dimly lit room, she felt something shift inside her, something small but powerful. A spark of determination that reminded her she wasn't just a victim of her past. She was a fighter shaped by it. And for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't held down by the weight of everything that had happened. A future where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting someone to hurt her again. A future where she could breathe freely, love freely, live freely. Without the chains of betrayal dragging behind her like shadows she could never escape. And she realized that healing didn't mean forgetting. Healing meant remembering without hurting, remembering without breaking, remembering without drowning. And in that moment she promised herself that she would no longer allow the ghosts of her past to dictate the rhythm of her life. She would no longer let the voices of people who tried to destroy her echo louder than her own. And with that promise she slowly stood up. Walked to the small mirror hanging on her wall, and stared into her own tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much pain but still burned with quiet strength. Eyes that held stories she had never told anyone because she feared no one would understand, but she understood. She understood herself better now. And she whispered to her reflection that she was done living in fear, done apologizing for being sensitive, done shrinking herself to avoid being hurt. And as she whispered those words, she felt a strange, fierce clarity rising within her, a clarity that told her she had already survived the worst days of her life, and everything from here on would be a new chapter. One she would write on her own terms, with her own strength, with her own courage. And as she turned away from the mirror and lay back on her bed, she finally allowed her eyes to close, not from exhaustion this time, but from relief, knowing that tomorrow would be different because she would be different. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally becoming the version of herself she was always meant to be. And when she woke the next morning, sunlight spilling through the blinds in jagged lines across the floor, she felt a strange combination of anticipation and calm that she hadn't allowed herself in years. A quiet readiness to face the day without the invisible weight of others' expectations pressing her shoulders down. And as she moved through her kitchen, placing her favorite mug under the coffee machine, lining up ingredients for a small batch of pastries she'd been experimenting with late into the night, she realized that her life was finally hers in a way it had never been, that every choice she made now, from the simplest to the most monumental, belonged to her alone. And she could feel the freedom in the way she breathed, in the way her hands moved with purpose, in the way she hummed a soft tune she hadn't remembered knowing for years. And it struck her how long she had lived under the illusion that love, family, and loyalty always meant sacrifice of self, that kindness demanded self-erasure, and that being strong meant holding everything inside until it burst. And she understood now that strength was measured not in what you could carry for others, but in what you could hold for yourself. The quiet, deliberate courage to choose boundaries, to choose peace, to choose authenticity over approval. And as she set the tray of fresh croissants on the counter, their warm aroma filling the small apartment, she thought about the people who had tried to shape her life with their judgments, manipulations, and expectations, and for the first time she didn't feel the familiar sting of guilt or obligation. She felt detachment. Not cruelty, not malice, just recognition that their stories were theirs and hers was separate, unclaimed by anyone but herself. And she smiled faintly, a real smile that had no shadow of apology behind it, because she knew she didn't owe anyone explanation, forgiveness, or justification for living a life that honored her. And she sat down with her coffee, pen and notebook in front of her, because after years of being unheard, of being misrepresented, of having her actions rewritten by the people closest to her, she wanted to write her story for herself first, not for anyone else, to fill page after page with the truth of her experiences, the struggles she endured, the lessons she learned, the love she had given and lost, and the resilience she had cultivated in the quiet spaces of her life. The resilience that had allowed her to open a bakery late at night, alone, to measure success in the rhythm of orders, in the growth of her confidence, in the small victories that accumulated quietly until they became undeniable proof that she could create a life worth living. And as she wrote, she thought about the confrontation on her porch 13 years after leaving her family's orbit, about the folder she had placed deliberately on the console, the notarized papers, the ledger, every boundary she had asserted, and how in that moment she had learned that self-respect was louder than anger, more enduring than resentment, and more necessary than approval. And it occurred to her that even if her mother, even if her sister, even if the world wanted to rewrite her narrative, the pen was finally in her hand, and this time she would not hand it over, she would not allow their assumptions to dominate her identity, and she realized that her business, her home, her nights alone in the kitchen experimenting with chocolate and sugar and dough, were not just survival. They were declarations of autonomy, proof that she could generate value, beauty, and stability without anyone else's validation, and that knowledge was intoxicating, grounding, and fiercely liberating all at once. And as she leaned back in her chair, thinking about the long road from fear and suppression to this delicate equilibrium, she remembered the countless nights she had cried silently. The nights she had convinced herself that being hurt was normal, that being overlooked was a mark of loyalty, that being erased from family life was somehow her fault. And now she knew that none of it was, that she had been the caretaker of truth, the observer of injustice, the silent recorder of inequities she never deserved. And yet she had survived, she had thrived, she had created a world that responded to her effort and rewarded her authenticity. And in that moment,